The children were heard before they were seen, not in laughter, not in play, but in a low, synchronized chant that carried through the pine trees. Villagers passing near the orphanage swore that, on still nights, the voices of dozens of children whispered the same phrase, over and over, until it dissolved into a silence so thick it felt like a hand tightening around the throat. By 1889, Whispering Pines Orphanage stood as a hollowed institution at the edge of Vermont's forests. Brick walls blackened with rot, windows veiled with mildew, and a chapel whose bell had not rung in 20 years. But if you listened closely enough, you could hear what the wind carried from inside, stories of children who had entered and never left. Whispering Pines was erected in 1852 by the Methodist Episcopal Church, under the guise of a sanctuary for God's forsaken. Yet, even in its founding, there was unease. The land itself had once been avoided by native Abenaki tribes, who claimed the pines whispered because they grew over an older burial ground, one not marked by stones but by silence. The church dismissed the warnings as superstition, branding it the devil's fear, mongering, but the locals noticed patterns. Workers who built the foundation fell ill. 2 carpenters went blind before completion. And the first orphan admitted, a boy abandoned on the steps, was found dead in his bed just 3 nights later, mouth full of soil. Still, the orphanage opened, because institutions built on suffering rarely close when they should. By the mid-1860s, Whispering Pines held more than 60 children. Their ages ranged from 3 to 16. Records show that each month, at least one child vanished. The explanation was always the same: runaway. Yet the nearest town was 7 miles away, the roads impassable for children, and no one was ever found. The truth whispered among townsfolk was simpler. The children weren't running away, they were being kept. Consumed, made into something else. Parents who tried to question the orphanage were told to leave it to God. The sheriff, a loyal parishioner, dismissed all reports. And when a group of mothers banded together to demand answers, the church threatened them with damnation, accusing them of stirring Satan's unrest. Inside the orphanage stood a small chapel, lit only by candlelight. The children were forced to kneel on stone floors until their knees bled. They were told that obedience was salvation, that silence was holy, but the children spoke of something else. In whispered confessions, they described a presence in the chapel that was not the priest. A figure tall as the rafters, draped in shadows, with a voice that came not from its mouth, but from the walls themselves. The orphans called it the tall listener. They claimed it asked questions, questions that dug too deep, questions no child should know how to answer. The matron of Whispering Pines was a woman named Constance Hale. She was described in records as pious, stern, and deeply loyal to the church. But diaries later recovered suggest something darker. Constance spoke of binding the children and silencing the rebellion of flesh. The priest, Father Malcolm, wrote of tests of endurance and ritual fastings meant to purge the devil's inheritance. Yet his language was disturbingly vague. What was being purged was never illness, nor hunger, nor sin. It was something deeper, something unnamed. The staff became less human with time, their faces gaunt, their eyes sunken. Villagers swore that when they saw them walking back from the woods, they were not walking alone. The pines surrounding the orphanage became part of the legend. At night, children said the trees spoke. They described voices calling their names, promising warmth, mothers, home. But when a child followed the whispers, they were never seen again. Only the trees remained, still waiting, their bark damp with something darker than rain. By the 1870s, locals had stopped cutting timber near the grounds. The wood carried a stench of iron, like blood rusted into the grain. Those who tried to burn it found their chimneys choked with smoke too thick to breathe. The land was no longer forest, it was a mouth. In 1874, a doctor named Elias Cartwright attempted to investigate conditions at Whispering Pines. His report, later suppressed, described malnourished children with deep scarring on their backs, tongues cut or mutilated, and eyes that flinched at candlelight as if it burned. Cartwright noted something else: the silence. The children did not speak in his presence. They only stared, as though waiting for permission, and when he turned his back, he heard them whispering, not to him, but to the air, as if answering questions that had not been asked aloud. Cartwright's report was buried by the church. He left Vermont shortly after. His practice burned down the same year. In March of 1878, melting snow caused the nearby river to flood, submerging the orphanage's lower floors. Villagers believed this disaster might finally end the institution, but when the waters receded, the building stood as if untouched. Inside, however, survivors reported a grim sight: children waist deep in stagnant water, holding hands in rows, humming the same three-note tune. When questioned, they could not explain why. Rumor spread that the flood had awakened something buried beneath the foundations, something that did not want to stay asleep. In 1881, state officials quietly began reviewing orphanage ledgers. They discovered discrepancies, dozens of names entered, but no adoption papers filed. The missing children were marked only with a single word: returned. Returned to what or to whom was never explained. When pressed, Constance Hale insisted the children had been given back to the earth. But investigators noticed another entry in the margins, written in an unfamiliar hand. They were heard. What did that mean? No one dared ask further. The records were sealed. By 1885, villagers swore that whenever a child vanished, the chapel's rusted bell tolled once at midnight. This was impossible. Its rope had been cut decades earlier, and no one dared enter the chapel. Yet the sound was undeniable, a single hollow strike echoing across the valley. Some claimed the bell was not announcing a death but sealing a covenant, that each toll was a child offered, not lost. And the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. 1887 became known as the Year of Shadows. That winter, 12 children disappeared in 3 months. The matron called them runaways. The sheriff filed no reports. But townsfolk whispered otherwise. They claimed to see children in the woods long after their disappearance. Pale figures watching from between the trees, always silent, always waiting. One hunter swore he followed a child's tracks through snow, only to find them end abruptly at the trunk of a pine, as though the tree itself had swallowed them whole. In early 1888, a group of older orphans attempted to escape. They set fire to the laundry building and fled into the forest. 3 days later, villagers found them wandering the road barefoot, shivering and unable to speak. Their tongues had been removed. When asked who had done this, one boy managed to write a single word in ash upon a stone: "Father." But Father Malcolm had not left the orphanage in weeks. Recovered notes suggest Constance Hale conducted a midnight ritual in the chapel. Witnesses described candlelight flickering against walls scrawled with words in Latin and Abenaki dialects. Constance believed she was binding voices to protect the children from eternal damnation, but the result was far from salvation. The children became conduits. Their whispers were not prayers but messages, spoken from something older than the church itself. And the matron listened with devotion. By late 1888, reports of the tall listener grew frequent. Children claimed it stood in the chapel's shadows during Mass. Some said its hand stretched to the ceiling beams. Others said it crouched among the pews, watching them with eyes that glowed like embers. When asked what it wanted, the children said it asked them one question: "Do you want to go home?" Those who said yes were never seen again. On October 13, 1889, Whispering Pines burned. Flames consumed the orphanage overnight. When villagers arrived, they found the building collapsed, the chapel reduced to ash, and yet not a single child's body was recovered. Only the bell remained half buried in soot. Its surface was marked with dozens of handprints, all charred, pressed into the iron as if melted there by desperate touch. The official report listed accidental fire, but survivors told another story. The children had set the fire themselves, not to escape, but to follow. In the wake of the fire, Vermont officials erased records of the orphanage. Adoption files, birth certificates, church correspondences, all vanished. It was as though Whispering Pines had never existed, but locals kept the memory alive. Hunters refused to tread near the ruins. Travelers swore they saw children among the blackened pines, whispering to one another in voices carried by the wind. And on October nights, the toll of a single bell could still be heard across the valley. 3 former orphans lived long enough to be interviewed in adulthood. Each described the same sensation, that they were never truly free. They spoke of dreams filled with tall shadows, of whispers that followed them into waking life. They never had children of their own. The listener, they claimed, did not allow it. One woman, before her death in 1932, wrote a final confession: "We did not survive. We were only carried forward." Excavations in 1946 uncovered fragments of the orphanage foundation. Beneath the chapel floor, investigators found a pit filled with hundreds of small teeth, some human, some not. The find was suppressed, marked as animal remains. But photographs, quietly circulated, showed teeth arranged in spirals as if planted like seeds, seeds waiting to grow. Today, the site of Whispering Pines lies deep in private land. Locals claim the forest there never goes silent. Even in the stillness of winter, you can hear the faint susurration of voices threading through the pines. Hikers speak of being followed, of finding child-sized handprints in frost upon their tents, of bells ringing in the distance, though no church stands within miles. Some say the children never left, that their whispers are a warning. Others believe they are an invitation. History buries what it cannot explain. Institutions silence what they cannot control. The forgotten tragedy of Whispering Pines was not a fire, nor an accident, nor a closed chapter in Vermont's past. It was a covenant, a wound that still bleeds beneath the soil. And if you walk among those trees long enough, you may hear it for yourself. A chorus of children whispering in voices that are not their own, "Do you want to go home?